come and see my farm. He's going to come anyway, and one or two people may have come already. My organisation is called the Sustainable Food Trust. Now, we're a very small organisation which I founded after I left the Soil Association in 2010, and our mission is to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems. And we have 3 areas of focus for our work. The first is to try to influence people in positions of leadership with new ideas and fresh thinking, but also build collaborative partnerships between people who very often, organizations very often tend to work in silos and don't think in an integrated and holistic way. Secondly, to try to influence the policy and economic environment in which all food producers operate. And thirdly, to try to communicate all these fresh but actually timeless ideas as widely as possible, because change can't happen unless it's driven by the force of informed public opinion. And we're a tiny team, and so we're working catalytically. We can't possibly deliver the change. There are many organizations in the world that are doing that. So we just want to assist the change that's trying to happen. And in that connection, I just read an article very recently, which I think we mentioned in our weekly newsletter, by an American guy called something like "The Food Movement is an Unstoppable Force for Change," which was very, very interesting article. I recommend you look it up. And it's very optimistic because it says, the food movement is cellular, it's caught the spirit of the time. Millennials, people under 30, get it. They sort of somehow grasp the need for change, and they understand more than my generation do, and the change is happening, and it cannot be stopped. But the truth is, if you really look at the way our food systems are today, that's not entirely true, clearly. There are barriers to change. Otherwise, we wouldn't be where we are, with 90% plus of all the food that's produced, processed and sold in supermarkets, produced in a relatively industrial way, which depletes natural capital, causes damage to the environment, and impacts on public health. And so the question arises, why? If there's an unstoppable force for change afoot, which I do believe there is the transition to truly sustainable food systems not happening more rapidly? So I thought I would start, because I like to start by reminding myself of my farm where I shall be tomorrow, with a case study of why it isn't happening. The case study is my own farm. My own farm is on a hill in West Wales. It's 135 acres of owned land, owned mostly by Triodos Bank, but we're gradually sort of acquiring more of it and then borrowing more again, so we've got a big debt. But we also rent we've just taken on some more land actually, so it's probably 300 plus acres we're farming now. We're closed down with TB at the moment, but hopefully we'll get out of that because we've been there before and we'll get out of it. And we have a dairy herd of 75 at the moment, Ayrshire cows that we purchased the foundation stock of in 1973 when we first arrived. And most of the herd are descended from those original cows, but not all of them. And we produce milk from those cows, which since 2006 we've been turning into cheese, and now about 80% of the milk that we're producing is turned into our cheese, which is called Havod, which is a single farm, obviously, unpasteurized when we're allowed not to pasteurize it, which we're not at the moment because of TB. And it's for sale in, a bit of it goes to Waitrose, some of it goes to Marks and Spencer's. Our best customer is Neal's Yard Dairy, and then it goes to Andy Swinscombe, who's a great cheese wholesaler up here, and other wholesalers, and quite a bit in Wales as well. And the policy that we've been operating on right from the beginning, really, although it's become more, we kind of invented it as we went along, as we learnt more, is try to operate with the farm as an ecosystem, a self-sustaining ecosystem, based on really what Rudolf Steiner said actually in his agricultural lectures in 1924, that the farm and the animals and the plants in it should become adapted to the place over time. And in a way, I think of my farm as like the natural capital of the hill. And our task as farmers is to harness this natural capital and to produce a genuine surplus from the nature the natural resources we've got. And we're trying to do that, not exclusively, but we're trying to do it minimizing our use of non-renewable inputs. So we haven't used any nitrogen fertilizer now for 43 years. We haven't used any pesticides. Well, we've used a bit of Bacillus thuringiensis, but I mean, basically we've used the pesticides. We try not to use too many veterinary inputs. We are trying to be self-sufficient in animal feed, which we haven't achieved yet, but we grow oats and peas, which we mill on the farm with a roller mill and turn it into a sort of cow muesli. We sort of cut a bit of organic cake into it. And you can see what we're trying to do. And also we're obviously trying to cycle nutrients as efficiently as possible and be energy self-sufficient and all the things that a lot of you are probably trying to do yourselves. And we're only on a journey, and it's not that we've achieved it, but it does seem to me that everything we're trying to do is kind of right by the planet and right by public health and right by the future of the sort of food systems we ought to have. Relocalized, adding value, vertically integrated on the farm, relying on the natural capital, building soil fertility, and operating with not a totally closed ecosystem, but with a principle of trying to operate on a cellular level. And for me, if I imagine the food systems of the future, that's how I think they ought to be. Lots of small farms, not so small farms, big farms too, but farms which operate in that way, adopting those principles. And the reason I wanted to talk about it as a case study is because I'm running two charities. There's the Sustainable Food Trust, and then there's my farm. And the farm, because I've got a day job, the cheese may change the story because we've been developing the cheese. We had to borrow a lot of money to finance the whole thing, all the capital to do it and everything, and then to finance a year's worth of milk, which obviously is in the cheese store because we're selling the cheese at sort of 10 to 12 months. But the cheese is theoretically our way out of the problem we've got, which is that farming in that way, maybe we could farm more efficiently. So we're farming as best we can, and I'm away a lot, so that probably is a minus. But it doesn't basically make money. And in fact, the money's coming into the farm from my day job rather than the other way around. And we haven't taken any money out of the farm for a long time. So if we can't make a go of this, farming in that way, with the grain of nature, trying to turn the genuine natural capital of the earth into food and make a profit, then it's hardly surprising that the vast majority of the farming community are not going that way yet, and that food processors and retailers are not doing that either, because there basically isn't a good enough business case for doing that. There ought to be a business case, and I'm not sort of telling a hard luck story because I think our farm is essentially inefficient. I don't think it's inefficient. I think it's because the policy and economic climate in which farmers are operating does not value natural capital, does not cost the damaging consequences of more intensive farming in terms of pollution, impact on biodiversity, and of course impact on public health, and also other social costs like employment and all the things which you said you should put a positive value on, and instead we put a negative value on by trying to make our farms more efficient and shed labour. So we're operating in a dishonest economic environment where the policies are not incentivizing the kind of farming I'm trying to do, and the true costs of production are not attributed where they need to be honestly attributed, and as a result, we can't do what we need to do. So I guess that represents one of the very major barriers to change that I personally experience as a farmer, and we need to unlock, because it seems to me that if you look at climate change, and you look at the way in which farming over my farming lifetime has really been an extractive industry. It's been a mining operation, really, mining natural and social capital. Unless we do something about that and do it pretty quickly, we're probably going to meet an ecological catastrophe, an environmental catastrophe, and a human health catastrophe. And you can see all the signs of those catastrophes gathering momentum. Now, The Sustainable Food Trust is trying in our small way to address some of those barriers to change. The first one that obviously I've mentioned a lot now is true cost accounting. In other words, trying to identify, categorize and quantify all those externalities, that's what economists call them, positive and negative. So there's like soil carbon is a positive, soil biology and soil carbon is a positive. Obviously water pollution is a negative, public health damage is a negative. But until we know how much damage there is and or benefit there is and we price it, it's very hard to then work out the carrots and the sticks, which would be, for instance, the redesigned Brexit, maybe, hopefully, not, policy package, or introducing polluter pays principle, like a tax on nitrogen fertilizer in proportion to the costs that it has to the environment or to the, getting into the water or the damage to public health, etc. You have to have a handle on the costs before you can then go to government or whoever else it is and say, well, why don't we tax this and make future agricultural subsidies dependent on farming systems which are delivering genuine public goods. And we are working on that. We had a conference in San Francisco in April with more than 100 speakers, and we're just about to produce a publication with a sort of, summaries of all the speeches that were made at that conference, and a lot of them are on our website as films, and some of them are really good. We set up a UK true cost accounting working group, which has had a rather slow start, but maybe it's gathering momentum. And we are doing other work on true cost accounting, including producing a report, an SFT report, which will be published in the near future on this. And we are also working on a set of sustainability metrics and indices, which I think will help that process, help frame that process. So that's one thing that we're doing to try to unlock the barriers to change. But another barrier is, it seems to me, and I mentioned that organizations work in silos, the nature conservation movement are not with us. Apologies for any nature conservation representatives who are in the room, but if you look at what the UK nature conservation movement have done ever since Rachel Carson's book was published, they correctly identified agriculture as the cause of the decline in biodiversity, but instead of addressing the root cause, which would be to change the way we farm so that we farm in harmony with nature, effectively the strategy of the RSPB and all the other nature conservation groups is to tacitly accept that intensive farming was an inevitable necessity to feed the however many billion people the peak population is going to be, and we will have to pay farmers to be nature stewards around the edge of otherwise intensively farmed land. That approach, that mindset, which is to separate nature from food production, in my opinion, is a complete disaster. Because it goes, if you think of children's storybooks, they never separate it. So we're telling lies to our children about nature and food production and harmony, when in fact on farms we've separated it. And it gets into the farmer's mindset, so the farmers invent an industrial language using industrial words for the food chain and the food industry because they think of it as being an efficient means of producing food. They don't connect it with nature. And in truth, it isn't connected with nature because it's become chemistry, and the 20% of the Common Agricultural Policy, which is currently going into the stewardship schemes, is increasingly, this is my experience with the Glasteer and the Tir Gofal schemes in Wales, you have to sort of shoehorn them around the edge of what you really want to do because they're forcing you to be paid to do stuff which isn't really kind of right if you're just trying to farm with the grain of nature on all your land. So it's deeply depressing, and it's embedded in the psyche of conservation organisations and in DEFRA and in the Welsh Assembly government and the Scottish government and everybody. They've got this, and so it's taking a load of money. And now even in the post-Brexit negotiations, there's been a meeting in London, which I didn't attend, but one of my team did, of, 84 NGOs. But they're all working in silos. You know, the fair trade movement's working in a silo. Even, dare I say this, the pasture-fed people might be working in a little bit of a silo. That's a discussion, because I'm a huge advocate of pasture-fed. But we need to think, and the nutrition people, my God, they're desperately working in a silo. And the whole debate in the nutrition community about the Eating Better Coalition, which which is basically eat less meat, and particularly red meat. There's such a lack of systemic thinking going on here. So we have to get organisations that theoretically are our friends in the NGO movement to come out and think in a more holistic way and work more holistically together. That is a major barrier to change. Then a third barrier to change, which we're working on, how are we doing? Oh, I can go on a little bit longer, is people in leadership positions need to acquire this thinking, because I think one of the problems that we've got at the moment in the food and farming world is that we've polarized a discussion which on the one end of the scale has got intensive, bad NFU type farmers, and on the other hand has got worthy, organic, biodynamic farmers or conservation organisations who are, and environmental organisations like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, who are sort of angry with bad food industry people, supermarkets and big farmers who are using lots of pesticides and stuff. And actually, there's a failure to understand why those farmers are doing what they're doing, because what choice have they got if they're going to stay in business if they haven't got a day job? And we, meaning the movement that I've been part of, tends to think of ourselves as right, morally superior, and we forming ourselves into our own little ghetto where we surround ourselves with nice people who think the same way as we do, and we don't reach out and become more inclusive in our approach. And I personally think we have to do that now, because if it's true that things are in as bad a state as I think they are, we have to sort of jettison some of our baggage and constructively engage with people who are just human beings and doing what they have to do to, make money in a difficult world when they're accountable to their shareholders or whoever it is. And we have to work together to redesign our food systems for the future. I don't think that's going to be at all easy, but I think that it's possible. And I think there are some really wonderful signs that there's a new spirit abroad and that actually could happen. And another thing that we're doing, this is more of an illustration of communication power. We've got a guy called Joel Salatin, who many of you will have heard of, coming to the UK on the week of the 23rd of November. And he's addressing a breakfast meeting in London. And then he's going to address a 1.5-day seminar in Gloucestershire on not an organic farm, but a farm that is going the right direction. And the first morning he's there, he's going to record an On Your Farm program on the farm, but not on his farm, because his farm is Polyface Farm in Virginia, which I visited last November. I think he's an amazing guy. I mean, he may not, to be doing everything as we would wish perfectly, but I think he's an incredible communicator and a great innovator and a visionary and a leader. And the fact that he's doing On Your Farm is so good, because that means, I don't know how many people get to listen to that program, but it's a lot. And then he's going to be speaking at a public meeting in Bristol as well on the evening of the 23rd of November, as well as these other meetings. And so I guess that's another thing that we can do in the Sustainable Food Trust. We can try to get communicators in the right places, because at the London breakfast meeting, we're going to have supermarkets there. We're going to have the Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davis, there. We're going to have a woman called Zoe Harkham there, who's an advocate of reinstating the true place of animal fats in the diet of the world, hopefully, which has been so disastrously affected by the NACNI and the Coma reports. I don't know if you know anything about the history of this, but basically in the 80s, a couple of government reports came up, which it now turns out were influenced heavily by the sugar industry, which demonized animal fats. And the result of which really was the whole British diet has changed, and Western diets have changed generally, and not in a good direction. And all the momentum of those two reports shifted attitudes profoundly and moved us away from relying on animal fats to relying on plant fats, most of which are produced relatively intensively and many of which are causing terrible, terrible impacts where they're produced, like, for instance, palm oil in Indonesia and elsewhere as well. So we need to find a way of creating a new discussion about animal fats of the right kind, obviously, forming a central part of our future diets. And I imagine Graham's probably spoken a lot about this earlier. But to me, this is a a really crucial part of the challenge. And then, if we can start to get all those forces aligned together, we then need to redesign our food systems. And I was talking to Robert about this earlier, that in a way we don't have a formed plan, or at least I don't have, in my mind, a completely formed plan about how we could redesign our food systems. I mean, I know that, as I said at the beginning, that my own farm, I feel, is like a cell. If you imagine the food system as an organism, then my farm is like what I imagine a healthy cell should be in it. And if you think of all the healthy cells working together, becoming more than the sum of their parts, then how can you get those products to people who want to buy them, retaining their story and carrying the values of the production system into their houses without being sort of homogenized and anonymized by an industrialized food system which has centralized distribution and everything else, but at the same time recognizing that cities have to have sort of efficient ways of getting the food in. And I think we have to do that. And we've probably got some wonderful examples out there where they are some of the, as it were, the ingredients of the redesigned food system, but we have to work harder to find a way to to scale them. And one of the things that we'll be discussing, I hope, at this seminar in Gloucestershire is the beginnings of how to do that, looking at case studies of successful vertically integrated marketing schemes, particularly for livestock products, because Joel Salatin is a livestock farmer, but not exclusively. And one of the things we're also going to be doing, and I'll stop here and then perhaps we can have a few minutes, is looking at ways in which we could find a different way of putting a value which then becomes transparent for the final consumer on the sustainability attributes of our farming systems. So to give you an example, I've been organically certified since 1985, but before we got certified, I actually had to write the dairy standards because there were no organic dairy standards at that time. In fact, there were no livestock standards. I was part of the Soil Association Livestock Standards Committee that drafted them, and they were a big influence. Well, they were really adopted by UCROS, which is the original organic UK body, and then they were the main influence on the EU regulation, and then that crossed the Atlantic to the National Organic Programme standards. So we can say that we definitely had a hand in the development of the livestock standards. But now, all these years later, 31 years later, I'm inspected, and I dread the organic inspection, if I'm really honest. I know that the inspector, perfectly nice person, is like acting like a police person looking for trouble. They're looking at, and they've invented a language, non-compliance, manifest infringement, so it's like a policing operation, and it's just, of course, all the other farm inspections are a bit like that as well. You've got to be compliant, otherwise you don't get market access, but I've just dread it. And my emotion at the end of the inspection is relief that we haven't either got found out for something we shouldn't have done, or that we've just got through again. And what I'm really interested in is whether my nutrient cycling is better than last year, or whether my biodiversity is better, or whether my soil carbon's increased. And surely, if you could capture that, and instead of having a system which says you're organic and you're not organic, so you're bad, we could say everybody's on the journey towards more sustainable production. My score is whatever it is this year, 65 out of 100. Next year I'd like to be 67, and I know my weak area because I've looked at it, and I've even maybe I've done a self-assessment tool. Maybe I filled it in and then it got independently audited. So I'm owning the fact that I'm good in some areas and bad in other areas. And I'm part of a ladder and a stairway which all farmers are on because we all want to become more sustainable. So that, I think, is a system which could be overlaid onto existing certification schemes. And of course, the pasture-fed scheme comes to mind, because if you're a pasture-feeding livestock producer, then that is a huge, and Joel Salatin, he's not organic, but he's producing fantastic quality animals. So how could you capture the value of that in a score? And then maybe he's got some downsides. That's fine. I've got some downsides, but then you strive to do better next year. So I think if you could find a way to get marketing labels to carry a score which captures their sustainability, and maybe you could then go to, you could have a website or a central place where you could have a look, because it should be transparent within reason. That would really be a very empowering and slightly disruptive way to influence the existing centralized food systems, because people would be able to see on the products. And it could be part of, I don't have to decertify as organic, it could have a score as well. So I'm not saying that this should replace the existing certification schemes, but we have to have some sort of convergence, because at the moment there's a massive amount of confusion in the marketplace as to what you should buy and what we should eat. No one knows what they should eat. Do we eat livestock? Do we not eat livestock? What ratio should it be? What kind of, is red meat terrible because of methane emissions, or is it part of the solution? All those sorts of issues. And I think that if we could develop these sustainability metrics, it would be a step in the right direction. So that's another thing that the Sustainable Food Trust is doing. And we think we're quite in a good position to broker this, because we have no wish to have any intellectual property over any of this. We can see that if you're an organisation that wants to develop a certification scheme, then the other organisations are going to look at you very suspiciously. But we don't want to do that. We want this not to be in the commons, and we want all our work to be in the commons, because we think that's what's needed at the moment.